Here's something they don't teach you in school. Real power doesn't wear a crown. It doesn't give speeches or sign executive orders. It sits quietly in a leather chair, reviewing loan terms while empires beg for liquidity. For over 2 centuries, one family understood this better than anyone. They didn't conquer territory. They financed the guys who did. And when the dust settled, the generals were forgotten. But the bankers, they were still collecting. This is how you build an empire that outlasts nations. Frankfurt, 1744. Mayor Amschel Rothschild is born in a Jewish ghetto where opportunity is basically non-existent. Jews can't own land, can't hold most jobs, can't even leave the ghetto on Sundays. But Mayer's got something most people miss. He's brilliant with numbers and he understands rare coins. By his 20s, he's dealing antique currency to European aristocrats who collect that stuff like baseball cards. Here's where it gets interesting. These nobles don't just want coins. They need money, real money, war money, and traditional banks. They're slow, they're local, they don't think big. Mayer sees the play nobody else does. If you can move money across borders faster than anyone, you don't just serve power, you become it. The hustle starts here. 18th century, and Mayer's got 5 sons. Instead of keeping them in Frankfurt competing for the same slice, he does something genius. He scatters them like chess pieces across Europe's financial capitals. Nathan goes to London, James takes Paris, Salomon heads to Vienna, Karl lands in Naples, Amschel stays in Frankfurt. 5 brothers, 5 cities, 5 governments. Suddenly, the Rothschilds aren't just a bank, they're a network. When France needs a loan, James handles it. When Britain needs bonds, Nathan's got it covered. They're not playing checkers while everyone else plays chess. They're playing a completely different game. And here's the kicker. They communicate through private couriers using coded messages, moving information days faster than official channels. In an era before telegraphs, information speed is everything. They basically built the financial internet before electricity existed. June 18th, 1815. Napoleon and Wellington are slugging it out at Waterloo, and the entire European economy is holding its breath. If Napoleon wins, British bonds crash. If Wellington wins, they skyrocket. Nathan Rothschild's got agents everywhere, including a courier named Rothworth who witnesses the battle firsthand. While official British messengers are still riding horses through Belgium, Rothworth crosses the English Channel and delivers the news to Nathan. Wellington won. Nathan now knows the outcome a full day before the British government does. Here's what most people get wrong. Legend says he crashed the market by selling, then bought low. Reality? He probably bought bonds immediately because he knew they'd surge. Either way, the man made a fortune by having better information infrastructure than the government itself. That's not insider trading. That's building a better system. Let's talk about how this actually works, because most folks think financial power is some shadowy control room where bankers pull strings. Nah, it's way more structural and honestly more interesting. Governments need money constantly, wars, infrastructure, paying off old debts. They raise this through bonds, basically IOUs with interest. But here's the catch. Not everyone can issue bonds that people actually trust. You need credibility, networks, and the ability to move that capital internationally. The Rothschilds perfected this. They'd underwrite government bonds, meaning they'd buy them first, then sell them to investors across Europe. If the bonds did well, they profited. If they tanked, they ate the loss. This created something crucial. Governments needed them. Not because the Rothschilds were puppet masters, but because they were the best at what they did. Dependency, not domination. That's the real play. Early 1800s, Napoleon's tearing through Europe like a wrecking ball, and Britain's got a problem. They're running out of money to fight him. Traditional funding sources are tapped out. Enter Nathan Rothschild in London. He arranges something unprecedented, moving massive amounts of gold to Wellington's armies on the continent, bypassing Napoleon's blockades through smuggling networks in neutral countries. We're talking millions in gold, moved covertly through hostile territory. The British government literally can't sustain the war effort without this pipeline. Napoleon eventually loses at Waterloo, and historians credit military strategy. But here's the thing. Wars run on logistics and money. Wellington had better supply lines partly because Rothschild capital kept them funded. This isn't conspiracy theory stuff. It's documented in British Treasury records. The family didn't start the war or control its outcome, but they sure as hell enabled one side to keep fighting. 1820s and Latin American 1820s and Latin American colonies are breaking free from Spain and Portugal. These new nations need recognition, infrastructure, and most of all, capital. European powers won't touch them. Too risky, too revolutionary. The Rothschilds, they see opportunity. They arrange loans for Brazil, Chile, and other emerging states, basically betting on the future of an entire continent. Some of these loans paid off. Others defaulted spectacularly. But here's what's important. By financing independence, they helped shape which nations survived and which collapsed into chaos. Brazil's 1824 loan of £3 million from the Rothschilds helped stabilize the new empire, allowing it to build institutions instead of descending into civil war like some neighbors did. This is financial power at its purest, not forcing outcomes but enabling certain futures while others starve for capital. You don't need to control governments when you control whether they can afford to exist. 1830s to 1850s, and Europe's about to be physically rewired. Railroads are the internet of the 19th century. They collapse distance, connect markets, move armies, and whoever controls them controls the future. The Rothschilds get this immediately. They finance railroad construction across France, Austria, Italy, and beyond. The Chemin de Fer du Nord in France, Rothschild money, Austrian rail networks, Rothschild capital. These aren't just investments. They're nation-building projects that reshape geography itself. Suddenly, troops can move hundreds of miles in days instead of weeks. Goods reach markets that were previously isolated. Economic regions that were separate become integrated. And the Rothschilds collect returns on every ton of cargo, every passenger ticket, every military transport. They're literally building the infrastructure that makes modern nation-states possible, and they're getting paid for it in perpetuity. This is legacy wealth creation, not quick flips, but generational assets that compound for decades. November 1875, and British Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli gets intel that Egypt's broke and looking to sell their 44% stake in the Suez Canal. This is huge. The canal is the shortcut between Europe and Asia, cutting months off shipping routes. If Britain controls it, they dominate global trade routes for generations. Problem: Parliament's not in session, and Disraeli needs £4 million immediately. He can't wait for legislative approval. So he walks into the Rothschild bank and asks Lionel Rothschild if he can front the money. No collateral, no board meeting, just a gentleman's agreement. Lionel does it, and Britain secures the canal shares. The commission? About £100,000, but the real play isn't the fee, it's the relationship. When a government owes you, really owes you, that's a different kind of capital. This moment shows the peak of Rothschild influence, moving millions on a handshake because their word was better than most governments' bonds. Here's where things get interesting and where conspiracy theories start warping reality. The Rothschilds had relationships with various central banks and governments throughout the 19th century. They helped establish banking institutions, advised on monetary policy, and yes, profited from these connections. But let's be clear about what this actually means. Central banks in that era weren't the independent institutions they are today. They were often private or semi-private entities with government charters. The Rothschilds were major players, not puppet masters. They had influenced the way Goldman Sachs has influence today through expertise, capital, and relationships, not through secret control rooms. The Bank of England, independent institution where the Rothschilds were important clients. The French central banking system, they participated, they didn't dictate. This matters because conflating influence with total control erases the actual fascinating history of how financial systems evolve. Real power is interesting enough without the fiction. Here's something that messes up the conspiracy narratives. The Rothschilds never dominated American finance. They tried. They had agents. They financed some ventures. They bought bonds. But America was different. Rougher, more competitive, and honestly more suspicious of European banking dynasties. When the U.S. needed Civil War financing, it was domestic banks and Jay Cook's bond drives that delivered, not Rothschild capital. When American railroads needed funding, it was J.P. Morgan and Vanderbilt money. The Rothschilds were minor players in the world's emerging economic superpower. Why? Because American capitalism was decentralized, chaotic, and didn't respect old world pedigrees. This destroys the idea of global financial domination. You can't control the world economy if you barely crack the American market. Late 1800s, early 1900s, and the world's changing in ways that erode Rothschild advantages. Telegraph and telephone collapse their information edge. Joint stock corporations with thousands of shareholders raise capital the Rothschilds can't match. American and German banks are aggressively competing. And then there's the anti-Semitism, always there, but intensifying across Europe. The family's Jewish identity, once just a social barrier, becomes actively dangerous. World War I devastates the European financial system the Rothschilds dominated. The Vienna branch loses access to Habsburg networks when the empire collapses. The Frankfurt operation struggles under German nationalism. The Paris branch survives but faces increasing competition. By the 1920s, the family's still wealthy and influential, but the era of Rothschild financial supremacy is over. They're one major bank among many, not the undisputed titans. History moved on, and their specific advantages became obsolete. Let's address the darkest chapter directly. When the Nazis took power, the Austrian Rothschilds were one of Europe's wealthiest families. Then came the Anschluss in 1938. The Nazis seized everything: palaces, art collections, banks, investments, the accumulated wealth of generations. Louis Rothschild was arrested and held hostage. The family had to pay an enormous ransom for his release and sign over all Austrian assets to the Reich. The Frankfurt branch had already been shut down. The family lost members in the Holocaust. The French branch was Aryanized, their property confiscated. This isn't abstract history. These were murders, theft, and the destruction of a financial empire through state violence. After the war, some assets were recovered, but nothing close to what was lost. Anyone claiming the Rothschilds control everything needs to reckon with this. They couldn't even protect themselves from fascism. Real omnipotence doesn't get liquidated by a dictator. After World War II, the Rothschild empire is basically fractured. The British branch, led by the London Bank, survived intact but diminished. The French branch had to rebuild from rubble. The Austrian and German operations were gone, wiped out. So what do you do when your multi-generational empire gets wrecked? You adapt. The London Rothschilds focused on merchant banking, corporate finance, and wealth management. The Paris branch, re-established after the war, went into similar territory. They're still dealing with governments, still arranging corporate mergers, still managing fortunes. But now they're competing with dozens of other banks doing the same thing. The magic isn't there anymore because the world doesn't need what they specialized in. Modern finance is about derivatives, hedge funds, algorithmic trading, global capital markets with millions of participants. The Rothschilds play, but they're not dominating. They're survivors, not conquerors. Let's cut through the nonsense. Conspiracy theories about the Rothschilds have circulated since the 1800s, most rooted in anti-Semitic propaganda. Claims they own all central banks? False. Verifiably false. Claims they engineered both sides of every war? Historically illiterate. Claims they control global wealth? They're not even in the top 50 wealthiest families today. Here's what actual historians document. The Rothschilds were Europe's most powerful banking dynasty in the 19th century. They financed governments, profited from wars, influenced policy through their role as creditors. That's significant, but it's not supernatural. People want simple villains to explain complex systems, so they invented an all-powerful banking family. The truth is messier. They were brilliant financiers who exploited specific historical conditions, then declined when those conditions changed. That's way more interesting than cartoon villainy, but it requires actually studying history instead of watching sketchy YouTube videos. Today, Rothschild and Company is a publicly traded company operating as a mid-tier investment bank. They do mergers and acquisitions advisory, wealth management, private equity. Their client list includes corporations, governments, and high-net-worth individuals. Annual revenue, around 2 billion euros. For context, JP Morgan Chase does that in like a week. The family maintains control through ownership stakes, but they're not running some secret empire. They're running a boutique financial services firm in a crowded market. They advise on deals, they don't dictate them. When a European government needs to privatize assets or a corporation needs acquisition advice, Rothschild and Company might get the call, or it might be Goldman, or Lazard, or any other advisory firm. The name still carries prestige, especially in European circles, but prestige is in power. It's just brand recognition. The Rothschild family in 2025 is scattered across hundreds of descendants with wildly different interests. Some stayed in finance. David Rothschild chairs the family bank in Paris. Some went into wine, Chateau Lafite. Rothschild is still family-owned and produces some of the world's most expensive bottles. Some became environmentalists, philanthropists, historians, or just wealthy private citizens with no public profile. The fortune is diffused. There's no central patriarch controlling everything like some mob boss. Inheritances got divided across generations. Investments went different directions. Family branches drifted apart. This is what happens to old money over time. It fragments. The myth of dynastic unity is just that, a myth. Real families are messy, full of disagreements, different priorities, and competing interests. The Rothschild name connects them, but they're not some coordinated conspiracy. They're just relatives with a famous last name and varying levels of wealth. Here's the real lesson the Rothschilds teach about generational wealth. Discretion is the ultimate asset protection strategy. While new money flexes on Instagram, old money stays invisible. The Rothschilds don't give interviews about their net worth. They don't flaunt. They don't trend on social media. This isn't just modesty, it's strategy. Public attention brings scrutiny, regulation, resentment, and risk. The families that last centuries understand this. They operate through trusts, private holdings, offshore structures, family offices that manage wealth quietly across generations. They diversify not just investments, but geography, asset classes, and family involvement. Some generations focus on growing wealth, others on preserving it, others on philanthropy. But the core principle stays consistent. Stay out of the spotlight, compound quietly, and never let the public know exactly what you're worth. That's how you survive revolutions, wars, tax regimes, and economic collapses. So what's the actual Rothschild legacy, stripped of mythology? They pioneered multinational banking when that concept barely existed. They proved that information networks could be more valuable than physical assets. They demonstrated how sovereign debt creates structural power that doesn't require armies or laws. They showed that patient capital, deployed strategically over generations, compounds in ways that quick money never can. And maybe most importantly, they revealed how economic systems often matter more than political ones. Kings came and went, but the creditors remained. Empires collapsed, but the debt survived. This isn't sinister, it's just how finance works. Money is a technology for coordinating human behavior across time and space, and the Rothschilds were historically great at using that technology. Their decline shows the limits of that power, and their survival shows how financial dynasties adapt when they can't dominate anymore. Here's what keeps me up at night thinking about this stuff. Political power is temporary. Emperors die, governments fall, constitutions get rewritten. But financial structures, those persist. The debts outlive the debtors. The systems outlive the founders. We're still living in a world shaped by 19th century banking innovations the Rothschilds helped pioneer. Sovereign bonds, central banking relationships, international capital flows. They didn't invent these, but they mastered them when it mattered most. Today, they're a footnote in a financial system that's moved beyond any single family's control. But the principles remain. Whoever can move capital efficiently across borders and time holds a kind of power that doesn't need titles or crowns. The Rothschilds proved that. They also proved it doesn't last forever. And maybe that's the most important lesson. Even the most powerful financial empires are just temporary custodians of capital that eventually flows elsewhere. The game continues. The players change. The ledger remembers everything. Subscribe channel for more updates.